In last week's Torah portion of Toldot, it says, Hakoil kol Yaakov vayidayim yedei Esau. As Jacob approaches his father for a blessing, Isaac says to him, your voice is the voice of Jacob, but your hands are the hands of Esau. So our sages tell us that when the voice is the voice of Jacob, then the hands of Esau are nullified. No longer are the hands of Esau. Now, it's very interesting. Our sages further identify what the voice of Jacob is. Notice it says the word koil, which means voice, twice. And so our sages tell us that one is the koil of the voice of prayer, and the other is the voice of Torah study. Koil Torah v'koil tefillah. So which one is which? Okay, so you have two times it says the word koil, voice. So you say, okay, so it means two voices, but how do we know which one is which? So Rav Tzadok HaKohen Lublin points out that the first koil has a hey, the second koil has a vav. Now, the God's name is Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. The Vav represents the source of Torah, and the latter Hey, the final Hey of God's name, represents the source of prayer, tefillah. So the first koil, first voice, which has a Hey, that represents the voice of tefillah, the voice of prayer. And the second koil, which has a vav, represents the voice of Torah. Now it gets more interesting. What was Esau's blessing? Among the things that Isaac said to Esau was, upon your sword you shall live, al charbecho tichya. With your sword you shall live. Very interesting. Now, if you look at the second to the last psalm, it talks about a double-edged sword. It speaks about cherev pepiyos biyadim, a double-edged sword in his hand. This double-edged sword, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says, one side of the sword is Torah, and the other edge of the sword is tefillah, prayer. Torah and prayer. Again, the same things, the two voices of Jacob, represented by the two edges of the sword. But it doesn't end there. Take a look. What word is used to mean edge of the sword? P, mouth. Same Hebrew word as for mouth. That P means my mouth. So the word for the edge of the sword is mouth. So yes, two mouths. So it's a two-mouthed sword. A mouth that mouths out words of Torah, and a mouth that mouths out words of prayer. So when one has this sword, when one wields the sword of Torah and prayer, then it nullifies the sword of Esau, and thereby it's a sword of healing rather than a sword of destruction. And I would like to point out something else. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says it's not enough to just have Torah and to have prayer. One has to make Torah from prayer and prayer from Torah. You make prayer from Torah when your Torah lessons you hear and you study, you pray over it. You beg God for deeper insight. You beg God for helping you to understand how to apply them, how to apply what you've learned, how to change yourself based on what you've learned. And then deeper insights come to you. So from prayer, you've made Torah, because the new insights that come to you through prayer itself, new thoughts come into your mind, new ideas, that itself becomes Torah. And interestingly, Rabbi Nosson of Nemirov wrote a book called Likutei Tfilos, which are his collection of prayers that he made based on the Torah that he learned from his Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Now, it gets more interesting. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov spoke about at the end of his first of the famous 13 stories. He told famous 13 stories. He called them tales, basically modeled on a fairy tale kind of style, and but they were interwoven with the deepest depths of Torah, so deep that they're hard to penetrate and understand, and they beg for deeper interpretation than is available. Now, at the end of the first of these 13 stories, it talks about a viceroy who's on a mission to free a princess. And at the very last stages of the story, he's carried by a wind to a golden mountain with a pearl castle. So imagine there's a pearl castle perched upon a golden mountain. Now there's a distinction between what makes gold valuable and what makes pearl valuable. Big distinction. Fundamental distinction. Gold becomes valuable when you remove what's imperfect about it, when you remove the non-gold, the dross, the other minerals. Pearl first begins to be created and becomes valuable in response to a imperfection that irritates the oyster, and it develops around it, and pearl includes the imperfection. Now, I'm not perfectly sure what I'm about to tell you. This is my own interpretation, and I haven't seen it anywhere. But I do wonder if the gold mountain represents Torah. The golden mountain represents Torah. Torah is something that's worked on by purifying to get to the real truth, get to the as absolute truth as possible. Prayer, so Torah would exclude the impurities. It seeks to exclude the impurities. Prayer, like a pearl, develops around the impurities. The person prays around the dark spots of his life or her life. Person cries out to God from the dark spots, from the difficulties, from what's imperfect, and it includes the imperfections, and it's specifically through including the imperfections that this beautiful prayer is made. So, but this, it's interesting how the double-edged sword, represents the final goal of creation, the final goal of healing, of the mouth of Torah and the mouth of prayer. And with that, I wish you Shavua Tov Varach. Thank you. Beautiful week, a guten Vach, a good week, a beautiful week, a happy week. Thank you for joining.